So I think at the individual level, that's what needs to be done. I think at the leadership level, I think really becoming aware that AI doesn't implement itself. And there was this great slide from this guy named Tiger from Bain and Company, and he put it up at the Autonomous Conference the other week, and it gave a continuum to like 0 to 100%. And he's like, 10% of AI is the tooling. Another 10%, or maybe it was 15%, is data and algorithms, and the rest of it is people.
Welcome, everybody, to today's episode of Facing Disruption. I am your host, AJ Bubb, and I'm very excited today. I'm always excited with my podcast. I have the greatest guests ever. So today I am also very excited to be joined by Melissa Reeve. She is the author of the upcoming book, Hyper Adaptive Enterprise, published by IT Revolution. Melissa has spent years in the trenches of organizational transformation, a topic that I lean into heavily when I'm talking and working with my clients. From lean and agile implementations to co-founding the Agile Marketing Alliance to 6 years with Scaled Agile. And I cannot wait to talk more about that. When ChatGPT hit, she saw something that others had missed. It's not just another tool. It's a fundamental disruption to the entire enterprise operating system. And that makes this topic perfect for our show, because we are all about talking about disruption that is happening in the face of change, in the face of these new technologies, especially driven by AI. And that is what we're going to dive into today. Why AI is going to compress both strategic and execution dimensions of how enterprises work. With that, Melissa, I will turn it over to you to tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into it.
I love that. And I'm just so excited to be on the show with you today, AJ. I was thinking, so yesterday was December 15th. And a year ago, December 15th, I woke up at 2 a.m. I couldn't sleep. And I started scribbling on note cards, these 5x7 note cards. And that was the start of the book, Hyper Adaptive, Rewiring the Enterprise to Become AI Native. And my inspiration, as you mentioned, came from this deep background in organizational transformation. And I had just been steeped in all the authors, people in this space know and love: John Kotter, Clayton Christensen, Peter Senge. And it just became really clear to me that this was the forcing function. AI was going to be the forcing function that would finally cause organizations to have to evolve. And so, I think it's appropriate that here we are a year and a day later chatting about this topic.
Yeah, a year is really fast to go from scribbling on note cards to getting your book about to be out there. And I think that's absolutely wonderful. So, before we get into how the organizations are transforming and what the disruption they're facing is, why don't we set the stage a little bit and look in history, like, where were they, right? Why are they needing to be disrupted? Let's go on a journey a little bit about
Yeah. Well, and I love to start with John Winslow Taylor in 1911. So we're going to go way back. And
way back.
The Wayback Machine takes us to 1911, and that was the year that John Winslow Taylor published the Principles of Scientific Management. So he was really the first person to look at management as a science. And when you think about what was going on at that time, you start to think about the assembly line. And so what he did is he said, there is a management class and a laboring class. And the management class's job is to find the one best way of doing things and impart that knowledge onto the laboring class. Now, I posit that some of that still remains in our organizations. So you start there, and then I want to fast forward us to after World War II. And that when we have this boom of organizations, they're going global, and we start to really see functional silos. And that's how organizations were structuring themselves in order to get the most efficiency. And we thought, okay, if we have a sales organization, a marketing organization, everything will be good. So we have the one best way of doing things imparted onto functional silos. And again, I think the vast majority of organizations out there are still operating in this way. Now, there are a few leading organizations that start to organize themselves around what we call value streams. So delivering value to the customer. And I think that AI is going to put such pressure on the organization in that way of working because, one, if you think about that Taylorism, there's no longer one best way of doing it. And it's not just constrained to management, right? Like AI has more patterns than we'll ever be able to comprehend. So that goes away. In the functional silos, it's just too slow. AI moves way too quickly for us to continue to organize in that way. So that's really setting the stage to say, okay, we know what worked in the past isn't going to work in the future. Now what?
I would be interested, did siloing really work in the past? Like, I just think back, I guess, obviously it was not working in 1911. And despite what some of my friends would say, I wasn't working near 1911. But I feel like we've always been criticizing or trying to break through the silos organizations put up. Right? So, why did that become the norm? Like, what was the science behind it that made silos the thing?
I think it just, like, it was something, I don't know is the answer. I don't have the research on that, but my intuition says that it made sense. It's that whole stripe, spots. Like, we kind of like hanging out with the people who are like us. We understand each other. And I do feel like when it first came to be, the world moved at a much slower pace. And so some of those handoffs between functions, it wasn't, there wasn't as much pressure to move as quickly as we have to today. And I think, to your point, we've been trying to bust out of those silos for at least 40 years. I think back to business process reengineering in the 90s and even before that. It just has become very, very difficult. And I think part of it is because we actually do like hanging out with people who are like ourselves.
I absolutely can see that, right? If you were working in a specific function, you can empathize with each other about that job, about the responsibilities. You have the same type of work, you can share. But then, you lose some of that cross-functionality. And that's where Agile really started coming in to kind of bridge the gap to where I guess we are now with AI forcing it. And before it was more of an intentional, like, okay, here's a better way.
Yeah. And what I love about what you're teeing up here is Agile absolutely wanted to break down those silos and said, let's put cross-functional groups of people together. The challenges that I saw with Agile, and I'd be interested in your observations here, is that this idea of cross-functionality worked to an extent when we had full-time people, but there were a bunch of these mishmash of fractional roles. Like, we just need the UX person for like an eighth of the time. We just need a tester for, the third of the time. And what do we do then? And it really didn't answer that question of what do we do with all these fractional people that we actually need to deliver value. And it's yet to be proven out. But my hope is that AI starts to smooth that out and enable that because our skill sets start to bleed into adjacent areas. And so it gives more people the skills they need to fill in some of those gaps. Oh no, what's your hot take?
I love where this is going because it feeds into a couple things that I've been saying, especially over the past 2 weeks. And I kind of want to let the conversation go and we'll back into that more. But this idea of the fractional teammate and then trying to optimize time, like this is something that I saw a really big challenge with is that in the pressure to extract every amount of productivity, we ended up with these fractional, I only need you for 3 hours.
Yeah.
Right. So, okay, let's make the math easy. I need you for 8 hours. Okay, 8 hours. That means that you can be on 5 projects in a week. Right.
Good luck with that.
Good luck with that, because the task switching is insane. And instead of having people who can own, like, how do you have any ownership over a bunch of fractional people?
Yeah. It's such a good question. In fact, I just today wrote this article, and it was about what I called the professional nagging system. And it's this notion that we have this whole layer of people in organizations that have incredible talent, and we've turned them into professional nagging systems. Like, hey, did you have this done? Do you got that done? Do you get that done? And so the question becomes, what triggered it was this concept of ownership. Because we have people whose job it is to follow up with other people, it's like, well, I don't have to worry about that. That's Jim or Jane or whoever who's worrying about following up with that. And so we start to abdicate ownership. Versus if we had AI automation doing that professional nagging, and it arrived in our inbox, and we were assumed that we were the owner of it, does that help shift that dynamic a little bit?
Okay, I love that. Let's talk more about the ownership piece a little bit before we even get into the AI piece, because I think the ownership is such a critical part. And I would love to see how you find it as also driving, like, the second part. AI is pushing the transformation. Ownership is, I'm going to assume you're going to say, a requirement.
Yes.
Like, people have to own it. So I'll just give a quick story I experienced. I used to run a pretty large team. We were delivering an app like any other agile engagement. Things started getting blocked. Blockers grew up. And then things started going sideways, mostly because what we had was blockers would add on to themselves, and then nobody was chasing them down, right? And the engineers or the designers, they would just pick up the next task. And we implemented a rule. You're only allowed to have 3 tasks. And if you're blocked, your only job is to unblock your task.
I love it.
Call 3 times a day. And the engineer, these are just Silicon Valley. These are highly paid. It's just like one guy in particular. Do you want me to sit here all day calling to unblock this? I said, yes.
Yeah. Nice.
That is your job now.
Yeah.
Because you own this ticket. Like, there's something more. So when you talk about AI now taking the nagging, let's talk a little bit more about that. Like, dive deeper. What is, like, do I just let that ticket go now? Do I say, yes, AI is handling it? Like,
No, I don't think so. I mean, what my hope is that AI is helping to triage a little bit more effectively. So, if that engineer still has to stay on the phone, okay, that is part of ownership. And the hope is that AI can help with some of that lower level work, and that people are in general more capable, because the subtext that I heard around what you were saying is not my job. And, it's not my job to handle the tickets. It's not my job to deal with the blockers. It's not my job. What if our jobs change from this functional specialization, right? Like, I kind of feel like it goes back to that. Like, this was an engineer who said, my functional specialization is engineering. That's my flavor. And my guess is that, I'm getting this visual of like peanut butter and jelly, like it's going to start smooshing together a little bit more. And so somebody can't just sit there and say, like, well, I'm peanut butter and you're jelly. And so I don't deal with jelly. I only deal with peanut butter. And we need to get people into this mindset of like, no, your job is to make the sandwich. And that's the goal. And my hope is that with AI and with these adjacent skills is that more people will be able to own the sandwich.
I love that. And that's exactly where my head is at. You need to be an owner.
Right.
And I agree with you. I think that, as we got into these functional silos and you think about the assembly line, and now you have somebody whose position is literally putting this widget to this widget and turn it, right? And I remember reading other studies showing that over time, first, it just completely demoralizes the individual. Second, you get worse outcomes because they don't understand the broader context, right? And then three, there's never any improvements because the managers are never on the line. So I love that you're saying the peanut butter and jelly, because, it's no longer an I am a blank. It's I am this and that. Like you have to duplicate it. So yeah, now I think we've painted a really good picture of the new ownership mentalities that people are going to have to take. Okay, the mentality isn't new, but I think what I'm hearing is AI is going to increase the requirement.
I think
of
so.
Ownership.
Yeah. Like we're, in getting that ownership mindset is more than just your functional specialty, right? So as you were talking, I was of course going back to my lean roots and lean manufacturing. And there is this sense of ownership in the Toyota production system where somebody at the front line, like maybe maybe they are just implementing or tightening some screws, although I think the robots are doing most of that type of work. But they're responsible for reporting any issues and then escalating those accordingly and working on continuous improvement. And I do feel like that continuous improvement part is also part of ownership. Because when we think about where AI is strong, it is really strong at feedback loops. And so I feel very strongly that part of the change that needs to happen in organizations is embedding this notion of continuous learning into the organization. And so when you own a process, and I want to dive into processes for a second, because when you own a process, that means you're thinking actively about the entire thing and not just your piece of the process. And AI is going to force us to reinvent our processes over and over and over again. My hope is that one step of that process is really reflecting on the learning. Like, what did we learn from this process? And what did we learn? How do we embed that learning back into the process? And I believe in the future that everybody's also got to be a process expert in a way, because they will have to get reinvented so many times as AI's capabilities continue to expand.
Yeah. So let's dive a little bit more into how AI is now changing the way that we're approaching like strategy to execution in this feedback loop.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm going to segue into the hyper-adaptive model here. Because
let's do it.
Let's do it. The premise of this hyper-adaptive model is that these linear organizations, which is what we've just been describing, right? You have strategy to execution, so many layers of the hierarchy going on there. You have concept to delivery, and so many handoffs and delays as things are getting from concept to delivery. And as we've just discussed, AI is going to smush both of those dimensions. And I believe that AI native organizations are those organizations that have these dimensions smushed from the beginning, right? They don't have this baggage of spinning up giant hierarchies or having a lot of delays. So they actually get that ownership from the beginning, from the get-go. Now, for enterprises and other organizations that aren't AI native, the question becomes, how do you gradually rewire yourself in an iterative and incremental fashion towards that more AI forward or AI native stance? And that is really what the model articulates is how do you do that gradually? Because we know it's not going to happen all at once. And we know that it also involves human change. And human change can be awfully scary to an awful lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's talk more in detail about that, because one of the things that I make this joke about, but it is kind of true. Whenever I see these layers of bureaucracy and complex process approvals, my first reaction is, who hurt you? Right? Because most of these are reactive, not proactive. So, you look at an organization, there's almost this legacy of baggage you're bringing that, for some reason, something went wrong. They had to implement this, they implemented that. I was talking to somebody about it this morning where he was complaining about, why is bureaucracy, why is there so much to get approvals? I'm like, well, you have the things that happen wrong. You have the people trying to protect their jobs. You have the people that found a power vacuum and inserted themselves into the process. So it's like, how does an organization even begin to step back and objectively assess their process so that they could say, we need to move from here to here?
I'm so glad that you highlighted that, and really you did a nice job articulating those three buckets of reasons why we have so much bureaucracy. Let's take risk. And some of that is spreading the risk. So it's not just any one neck on the line. Let's make sure that we have multiple people looking at this. My hypothesis is that when we have AI to do much more in-depth analysis, we spread the risk, in part because we're so cognitively limited. It's limited by the knowledge in the room, the data in the room. And when I think about what we do in so many of these meetings, it's debating opinions. Well, what do you think we should do? What do you think we should do? I don't know.
Yeah.
We pretend to have the data that we don't actually really have. And so what actually happens when we inject rich data, rich scenario modeling into this decision-making process? Does it de-risk the decisions? And do we start to shift that culture from having multiple necks to hang to, pardon that, probably not the best analogy. Anyway, you know what I mean. Do we get better at decision-making? The second piece is around power and power dynamics. And that is really how power is measured in organizations today, is the number of people who are under you and the number of budget, the amount of budget you control. And we have some pretty perverse incentives that keep that loop going. And so what we've got to do is we've got to shift the funding models and the incentive models. So from a funding perspective, rather than having these yearly debates around budget where it's very territorial, you end up with your prize of your budget, we move to, again, AI forward budgeting that looks much more dynamic. If AI is recalibrating budgets on a monthly, weekly, daily basis, we're taking those debates out of who can shout the loudest for the most budget. And we're saying, hey, we can trust the machines to recalibrate this budget. So that takes one of the power levers out. And then in terms of the incentives, I think we really have to look hard around the quarterly rewards that are happening for executive, especially at the executive levels, and how do we align that to different sets of outcomes? And I think that starts to shift some of the power dynamics. But I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I think it's going to be incredibly complex, and I think there's going to be a lot of people who will resist it.
So let's talk a little bit about then AI's role in this process here, because I think a lot of what we hear, a lot of what I see, AI is taking jobs, and those jobs are usually the hands-on keyboard type jobs, the front of the line type jobs. But then what I'm hearing you say about AI making the decisions around budgeting, this sounds more like the leadership, management, operational side job. So we're kind of coming in at the top of the pyramid, not so much the bottom of the pyramid.
Yeah, and I do feel quite strongly that I don't love the narrative that jobs are going away. I don't think
agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like we talked about this, I think it's supported to a certain extent and we've got to manage to it. What I see happening is we see jobs shifting from people doing the tasks to building, monitoring, and maintaining automations and AI that does the task. So let's just say that we were going to switch to this dynamic budgeting. Instead of taking a bunch of people and having them spend, some of these budgeting processes are, they're months or weeks long, and it's really painful. So if we have automations that dynamically do that dynamic budgeting, you still will need the human in the loop. You'll still need a human evaluating all the different scenarios that AI is proposing. And I think they're just better informed. And I think it happens more frequently. So if I was a leader and that I was in charge of it, I'd actually be very, very happy that I don't have to crunch those numbers. Because that's really the constraint around budgeting is it's such a heavy lift that we can only do it once a year. And so if we have AI-powered dynamic budgeting, all of a sudden our capabilities expand, allowing things to accelerate.
Yeah, I had not realized the complexity around even just cash flow management in terms of until I started talking with somebody. He's a CEO of a virtualization company and they have a lot of recurring revenue coming in. And now he's like, I have no idea. Like on a day-to-day basis, our numbers are a couple weeks behind because just reconciling everything. I had no idea. And he's like, I have a team of people who do this for me. This was already 15 years ago, so I'm sure that they've gotten a lot better at it. But yeah, it is an enormous undertaking. But even that, so the budgeting, this is, a very mechanical type of process, but I can even see the potential. I'm thinking back to my time at Amazon, and at Amazon, it felt like we got into just all year planning.
Yeah.
Right. You used to have to do these, your OP1, your operational plan for the year. And then halfway through, you update it with your learnings and findings and you pivot from there. And by the time I left, it was just like, oh yeah, we're already working on it just nonstop. You never had time to do the work. I would imagine that they need to be embracing this as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just so much of it was just trying to re-articulate based on no data coming in because you didn't have time to do the work.
Right. And that's just it, is as things speed up. I was just on the call earlier today and it was with pretty much heads of technology, and they were talking about vibe coding and how, it was the big question, are jobs going away? And they're like, I don't see how that could, because now we're generating so much more code that we have to validate. Like QA has just gotten exponentially more complex as we're trying to figure out what code's been generated. Is it truly working? Is it really production ready? At least at this particular moment with AI, man, the volume and the speed is actually causing more work for so many people.
Ooh, so now let's draw a parallel to something that you started at the beginning of the conversation, which was about people having the role of the professional person who nags for getting the blockers. Yeah. So now with the amount of QAing that has to come out, are we going to see roles just shift to professional? The term everybody uses is AI slop. Yeah. Let's call it for today. Let's say today it's sloppy, but for today, are they just going to be QAing AI slop?
Well, maybe. I think that will fix that pretty quickly. But what I do think those roles will change from monitoring the work and chasing people down to say this is due or that's due or do you have that done? I think there's going to be a lot more alignment work. So when we have so many more capabilities, that means there's so many more things we could potentially be working on. And we can't be doing it all. And so how do we actually sift through what we do, where we spend our time? It's the age-old question of prioritization and alignment. Like, that doesn't go away.
I am laughing right now because this is what I've been saying is right now is the worst time to be a creative entrepreneur ever, because you have so many options and you could do so much.
Yeah.
And at least before, you could dream and say, oh, I wish I could build this app, but I don't have the funding. I don't know how to program. You could come up with excuses. I don't believe you can come up with excuses for a lot of stuff. Like even, I think with some of the physical technologies, you're not going to be able to go and just start building new compounds and stuff like that. But you can get into generative design.
Yeah.
That's been out for a decade more than that. So it's like the excuses are leaving. So how do you sift through and prioritize? How do organizations sift through and prioritize?
Yeah. I mean, I've got frameworks to help. One of them is called Focus, right? Appropriately.
Okay.
Yeah. So that one is like, the first one is fit. Is this a strategic fit? So let's say that you're just trying to spin up a bunch of AI stuff. We got to use AI, right? Like that's the directive that comes down. We got to use AI. All right. Well, does it fit with your strategy? The O is organizational pull. Like, will people use this thing? So, even if you're a solo entrepreneur, are you going to build it? You can build it. Are you going to use it? How often are you? So the speed and capability. And I think that's important too. Do we have the skills on hand to actually do it? And while a lot seems possible, I don't know about you, AJ, but for me, when I go in to build these automation, like it seems so easy on the surface. And then I get halfway through and I'm like, oh, this is a lot harder than I thought it would be. So do we have the capabilities? You as the underlying data, do we really have clean underlying data that's going to inform the thing? Because that's so critical. And then the S is the success metrics. Like, can we actually measure the impact that it's going to have? And I'll just give a story, which is social media automation. Like, it's the thing I love to hate. It seems like there's a new social media channel happening popping up every other month or something like that. And it's hard to keep up with it. And I just keep thinking, oh, if I could just build an automation to handle it, it'd be perfect. But it's imperfect right now. And so when I put it through something like Focus, I'm like, it's not a great place for me to spend my time right now.
Yeah. And I love the example. It's very relevant, which means it's probably a good time to invite everybody to like and subscribe this video. My editor always says, AJ, you forgot to do that. So everybody, yes. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The process looks easy from 50,000 feet. And that's a good tie-in back to what you said all the way at the beginning about, this management layer coming in to figure out the best way to do the job. And I would argue, was that ever the right approach? They're so far away from the actual process. Because once you dive in and you don't realize the little details, that takes up so much time just to kind of figure out what's actually happening.
Well, it reminds me of what you said around, oh, well, we only need you for this 8 hours on this project, so let's put you on 5 projects. And I'm like, okay, that allows no time for context switching. It allows no time, variability from week to week. And that's an example of a disconnect where a manager might sit there and say, oh, 8 hours, we can have 5 of those projects, when the reality is much, much different than that. And I think what you're pointing to is decentralization. And how can we, and this actually goes back to our question of ownership, right? So how can we decentralize? How can we decentralize in a way that empowers people, to give them ownership, to give them more autonomy, while establishing enough guardrail that we stay out of trouble and de-risk to pull in that part of the conversation?
Yeah. And ownership, I feel like ownership definitely comes from from two directions. The individual has to claim ownership, but they also have to be empowered with ownership.
Yeah.
Right? To make those decisions.
It's true. As you were talking about, I was actually thinking about home ownership, and the other angle I think we don't talk about enough is, I don't know, I'm trying to find a delicate way to say this. Like, ownership doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. So if we take a look at home ownership, there's people who, are out there manicuring their garden 4 times a week, right? And they look great. And then there's other people who have different priorities. And for them, like, a weedy front lawn is a sign of environmentalism. And yet they might still say, well, yeah, I've got a strong sense of ownership. And so how do we level set even something as simple as, seemingly simple as ownership? And you ask, like, well, what are the leaders going to do? Well, there you go, right? Like, how can we as a leader set the context and create this arena of understanding and expectations throughout the organization, whether that's 10 people, 10,000 people, 100,000 people. And I feel like that work is not going away with AI.
I agree. If anything, I think it needs to be accelerated. So with that, what have you seen as a successful strategy for leaders to demonstrate this is the values of the organization? This is ownership.
Yeah. I don't know if I've got an ownership example, but yeah, I guess I'd point to this as an ownership example, which is Moderna. And I love this example because what they said is, we're going to release 15 new drugs to market in 5 years with AI. And so all of a sudden you have this North Star that pretty much anybody in the organization can align around. If you're in sales, like, okay, how can I help the organization do that? If I'm in R&D, how can I help the organization do that? If I'm in marketing, how can I help the organization do that? And it helps to automatically filter out your use cases and align people, and they can own their piece of that. And okay, I understand what we're trying to do. And now my work is to translate that into my role and see how I can contribute to the bigger whole. And I feel like even something as simple as that is so important in the age of AI, because when you think about it, you're not really saying like, hey, go use AI. You're saying we're trying to achieve this with AI. And that I think really helps people claim a sense of ownership.
Yeah. Yeah. And even just articulating, we're trying to do this, I think I would love to know what you have been seeing, but haven't started working in 1911, but over the past 20 years have felt that there's been, even as I've climbed the ladder, I feel like sometimes in some organizations has become less clear to what are we trying to do? Like that messaging wasn't even coming down. And now it feels like that messaging is even getting murkier.
Yeah. It's so weird. Yeah. In fact, I was just on a call this morning, and this individual was talking about the struggle of their executive direction, because executives are struggling right now. Many of them don't have enough context or grounding with AI to even set a strategic direction. And so what's happening is they give it the hand wave. Like, the board says AI is important. What's your strategy? They're like, well, we bought Copilot. And then they do a
very timely example.
And then, and then they do the hand wave down the chain, and they ask their next level down, like, what are you doing with AI? And then that level asks the next level, well, what are you guys doing with AI? We bought you Copilot. And there's just no unifying directive. And I don't say that as an accusation, because, it's new. It's new, and it's hard, and I've been at this full time for almost 2 years now, and the amount of overwhelm in the beginning, whereas I don't even know what headlines to pay attention to, it probably took a good 6 months before I was like, had the rhythm of like, okay, that's just an update to this, and that's an extension of that. And now I understand what's really newsworthy and not newsworthy. And so if you're an executive and you have a full-time job, asking them to absorb all of this is a lot. And so I think you do have to turn to outside people who it is their full-time job to help inform what you have going on. I just don't see really how else do you get a sense of that?
Yeah. And, it's interesting you say turning to a full-time person or turning to an external person who spends their time doing this, because I would also say that the promise of AI, part of that is that it alleviates the need to go to other people. So if you can do more with yourself less.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know if that made sense, but basically it's saying that you can yourself do more with less.
Yeah.
But that I don't really think is true. Like what you were saying, the overwhelm of outputs, the overwhelm of headlines, an AI comes in to promise you that you can absorb all of your headlines and trends and, make up some AI app that will raise $100 million here. But that is just another layer of overwhelm.
It is, as you're talking, it reminds me of another article that I was writing, and it was talking about the aperture of a camera. And, this has been my learning through the past 2 years, which is AI is really good at giving you the exact answer where you point the camera and how big the aperture is. But anything outside of that, it really isn't that good at. So you could, to your point, you could point it at headlines and say, give me all the headlines of AI and it'll distill that for you. But there might be stuff that's surrounding that or specific context or nuance that AI isn't going to include. And I feel like, especially if you're in a leadership position or an executive, like that's really the synthesis of the surround and those connections that happen organically as you're thinking about this article A you read and then article B. And an AI synthesis isn't necessarily going to give you the context and information that you need. And I do want to clarify, like, I don't think you need to go outside necessarily to get that information, but I do think it needs to be a separately resourced thing. Even if you had something in-house and you're like, hey, I just need you to to keep track of all this to inform the executive team. Like, I do think it is a dedicated resource. And I also think that that's another thing that most leaders aren't dialed into quite yet, is like, this actually requires resourcing.
That's a really good point about leaders not being dialed into that. I would say it's even more than leaders, that we have not passed down the knowledge well on the amount of work it takes to get a job done.
Yeah.
And the news thing, I think, is such an easy to understand, perfect example of a process that in the past you had an assistant looking through the papers. Okay, you have to read these articles. You had a PR team scouring the news. And then over time, it's like, oh, just set up a Google alert, just set up a AI app. Oh, just spend your morning reading. And all of a sudden, we feel like we should be able to do it ourselves. And the reality is we were never able to do it ourselves.
Yeah.
So are we also just missing the point on what a realistic human bandwidth looks like? And I think we're going out off the rails. I'm just in my head. I'm like, oh, I'm seeing this trend of us being burned out, and maybe it's because we're doing too much.
Yeah. Well, you're really causing me to think. I'm going back in my head to the early 90s and the beginning of my career, and I'm thinking to myself, you know what, you're right. I remember my boss got the Wall Street Journal delivered every day, and like the first hour of his day was scanning the Wall Street Journal. He did have an assistant sitting outside of his office that could help with that. that task. And now, even though we have these powerful tools, like imagine every day that you get 1,000 editions of the Wall Street Journal delivered to that assistant desk, and then that assistant can somehow still magically comb through 1,000 editions of the Wall Street Journal or the various publications and distill down the 75 most important articles. It's still too much.
It's still too much.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like we're just hitting the limits of what's productive to absorb.
And I think that this kind of leans into why it's so important that both individuals and organizations begin to sift through their backlog and priorities, as you were saying, right? You have to start somewhere, but I guess you also have to end somewhere.
Yeah.
Like you need to put up those guardrails and say like, do whatever you need to do in between these walls.
And that's always
go
been
to
the
the
hardest
goal.
part, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like the saying no, I come from a marketing background and we're notorious for saying yes to everything and then, being completely overwhelmed. And I feel like that's yet another angle of this people change that will probably have to take root out of necessity, or we're all just going to drown in like the 100,000 use cases that AI can help us with.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about some of those actionable frameworks that you mentioned. Like, what do we need to do? And lately, I like posing this question in a tiered model. So the individual, the leader, and then the organization, right? What do they need to start thinking about from each one of these tiers as we progress into this hyper adaptive world? AI is giving us too much information.
Yeah.
Let's start with the individual.
All right. So
If that is all right.
Yeah. So the individual, I think as an individual, I'm trying not to go to the trait, like play with AI. I think look at your workflows and really try and find the friction, because it's the 15-second thing that happens over and over and over. Like just try and think through that and think about like how AI can help you. And if you don't know, like if you're just getting started, like find the person who does know. Because what I'm seeing is this bifurcation of like the people who know and the people who don't know. And the people who know aren't necessarily being super proactive in sharing that knowledge with the people who don't know. And sometimes it's just they don't know that's what they're supposed to do. But I like to say AI learning is social learning, so go be social. Go figure it out, go watch some YouTubes and do that. So I think at the individual level, that's what needs to be done. I think at the leadership level, I think really becoming aware that AI doesn't implement itself. And there was this great slide from this guy named Tiger from Bain & Company. And he put it up at the Autonomous Conference the other week. And it gave a continuum to like 0 to 100%. And he's like, 10% of AI is the tooling. Another 10%, or maybe it was 15%, is data and algorithms. And the rest of it is people. And so recognizing that AI integration is really all about the people, just so counterintuitive. I think it's important for leaders to understand that. And then that ties in. Go ahead.
I agree 100%. Almost every problem is a human problem.
Amen.
So I love that. Yeah.
And then from the organizational level, then you have to have this light bulb that goes off and says, we need to do two things. One is we need to fire up some support structures to support the people. And in my model, that starts to look like AI activation hubs, which is a network of hubs in your organization that can help to contextualize and deliver training on an ongoing basis into the organization. It's an AI impact hub that says we understand roles are going to change. What is the impact on the organization? How do we rewire these jobs? How do we support people through the change? So firing those up, and then organizationally really understanding the shift that needs to happen, and understanding that that is an entirely new operating model, and that's going to be a really big thing that happens over the next X years.
Maybe months at this point.
Maybe.
Even. I mean, the pressure, I agree with you. The pressure is immense. I'm hearing a lot of good stuff. I'm hearing a lot of positive things. And I think that's important, especially in trying to counteract the doomerism content coming out and how many people are seeing instability. They're seeing uncertainty. It's hard, and organizations are, trying to figure out their way too. So I think it's important that we do definitely recognize that what everybody's going through is real, and we're all going through transformations at the same time.
Yeah.
This is a interesting era to be in.
So I did a deep research. This is another benefit of AI, right? That I had a curiosity and I was able to stick deep research on it. And my curiosity was this: how does today and the potential disruption facing white collar workers compare to the disruption that happened to blue collar workers in the 70s and 80s as manufacturing went offshore and certain towns were decimated? And what lessons can we learn from that period of time that we could potentially apply to now? And I think it's important for people to think about it because it does point to the fact that there are going to be jobs and people who are displaced. So the insights are as follows. The first is don't wait. Because what happened then is there was some upskilling that was available, but it was implemented a year or 2 years after people left their manufacturing jobs. By that time, they were demoralized. They felt like they couldn't learn new things. So the lesson here is learn while you can and learn while you are in place. The lesson for the corporations is invest in your people, because that person whose job is going away might be able to build or monitor or maintain the future. The second thing is you have scarce resources. And so not everybody is going to make the cut. And this points to this notion of not everybody wants to build, monitor, and maintain the automation. And so accept that. So rather than upskilling everybody and saying we're going to do this unilaterally against everybody who's displaced, really try and find those people with those aptitudes and laser target your upskilling towards those people. And we'll have to come up with safety nets for those other people who are choosing different careers, maybe choosing not to be in the workforce, and supporting them in other ways.
Yeah, it is. There is some level of personal choice that people need to decide, is this what I want to do? Will I learn the new skill? And I empathize. Hey, I don't want to be on the bandwagon on everything all the time. It's hard. It's a lot to try to conquer. So yeah, hopefully, we do find a way that we can start to reposition people in a way that makes sense. And I'm sure over time we'll have to. So, you mentioned you work with a lot of organizations on this. Tell a little bit more about how people can get in contact with you, what the questions are that they should be asking themselves, and when it's time to say, I need Melissa's help.
Yeah, I appreciate that, AJ. So I'm really right now focused on enterprise organizations that are trying to make this shift from linear into hyper adaptive, who have some level of recognition that they need these support structures and they need to put them in place, and they're looking for that blueprint. And when you're at that point, give me a call. I've got a research-backed blueprint that distills the success patterns of the leading organizations. And anybody can reach me either on LinkedIn, Melissa Reeve, or hyperadaptive.solution. Yeah, really appreciate our conversation here today.
Yeah, this has been really great. I think we tied so many things together. Melissa Reeve, the author of the upcoming book, I cannot wait to get it, The Hyperadaptive Enterprise. I am looking forward to reading it and sending you notes. And I say like, oh, I totally agree with this. And like, let's share some war stories on it.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much. Any final thoughts that you wanted to share before we close out?
Well, just thank you for having me on the show. And for those who are out there just not knowing where to begin and feeling like you can't keep up, you are not alone. I remember hearing a woman who was working at OpenAI speak at a recent conference, and she just kept saying, I'm just so exhausted. So even though you're right on the front line are having a hard time keeping up, you're not alone.
Yeah, I love that. Maybe that becomes a new sign off for this show, that if you are struggling to get on top of things, send us a message and we'll give you some inspiration to move forward.
You are not alone.
We could build a little bit of a community here. So thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thanks for having me.